All right, welcome back everybody to another deep dive. You guys know I love a good deep dive. And today we're diving into something that's been honestly kind of bugging me.
Yeah.
It's well, a lot of you have been sharing these thoughts, these articles, and it's all about like are we losing our empathy? Are we becoming less moral, less tolerant? It's a bit heavy, but we got to tackle it.
It's definitely a big one, but I think, looking at the stuff you sent over, there are definitely some clear trends emerging.
Okay, so let's just jump right in, I guess. One thing that really stuck out from what you sent me was this whole idea of individualism, right? Like everything's about me, me, me.
Right.
Does that like automatically mean we're less empathetic?
Well, it's not quite that simple, but there is some research out there that suggests, yeah, if we focus too much on ourselves, too much on our own needs, it can make us less likely to do things that benefit others.
Yeah, that makes sense.
It's kind of like, that whole tragedy of the commons thing. If everyone's just out for themselves, ultimately everyone loses.
Ooh, yeah, like those shepherds, right? With their sheep
Yeah.
overgrazing everything until the land is just barren.
Exactly. Same principle, really. Except here, the commons, it's like our social fabric, our sense of community. If we're not careful, we can deplete that too.
And then alongside that, there's this whole, I mean, the irony is killing me. We're more connected than ever, but everyone feels so lonely. Does that tie into this whole empathy thing too?
Absolutely. Empathy, it grows from real connection, really seeing each other, understanding each other's feelings. If we're not having those genuine interactions, it's way harder to put ourselves in someone else's shoes.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense. It's like you can be surrounded by people but still feel totally alone, which actually kind of leads perfectly into the next thing.
Technology.
Oh, you read my mind.
Well, it was in your notes.
Right, of course. But seriously, this whole online world, is it making things worse? I mean, texting, I'm so sorry, just doesn't hit the same as like a real hug?
You're 100% right. Online communication, it's missing that emotional depth. Like you can't hear someone's voice crack when they're holding back tears.
Yeah.
You can't see their face soften when they really get what you're going through.
It's like emotional flatlining. Everything just kind of feels the same.
In a way, yeah. Plus, you've got the algorithms. They're constantly feeding us stuff that we already agree with.
Yes, the echo chamber effect.
Exactly. So we're less likely to encounter different opinions, different ways of seeing the world.
Which makes it harder to even try to understand where someone else is coming from.
Exactly.
And then there's the whole, man, this is a big one for me, the constant distractions.
Yeah.
The need for everything to happen right now.
Yes, yes.
Does that affect empathy too?
It can, yeah. Empathy takes patience. It takes, sticking with something, even when it's hard. But technology, it trains us to jump from one thing to the next. Our attention spans are shrinking.
It's like we're losing the ability to be present, to really listen, to like sit with someone in their discomfort.
Right. And all of that is crucial for empathy.
Okay, so we've talked about individual focus, isolation, technology. It's kind of a lot.
Yeah.
But there's even more, right? Like the pressure cooker of modern life.
Ah, yes. That's a big one, too.
Does that really like chip away at our empathy? All the stress, the competition, the constant hustle.
When we're chronically stressed, our focus narrows. It becomes all about survival, about taking care of ourselves.
That makes sense. Kind of a self-preservation mode.
Exactly. It's harder to extend compassion to others when you're constantly worried about, keeping your own head above water.
And speaking of keeping your head above water, economic inequality. That's got to play a role, right? It feels like the gap between the haves and have-nots just keeps growing.
You're right. And when that happens, it can create this us versus them mentality. It's harder to see our shared humanity when basic needs aren't being met for so many people.
Right. It's like if you're struggling just to survive, it's hard to care about what's happening to people who seem a million miles away. And then, there's this whole thing about like the breakdown of traditional community structures. Those local groups, clubs, religious organizations, things like that. I mean, they're changing for sure, but do they matter for empathy?
They do. They offer these spaces for people to connect, to build relationships, to support each other. When those institutions weaken, we lose those opportunities.
Right, those shared experiences, those common goals, they kind of bring people together. Okay, shifting gears a bit. You also mentioned changing values and norms. This one's tricky. Like moral relativism, this idea that there's no absolute right or wrong. Does that make it harder to like even agree on basic values?
It can, yeah. I mean, on the one hand, it's great to be tolerant, to be open to different viewpoints. But if everyone's truth is equally valid, it can be hard to find common ground. It can lead to moral confusion.
Right, like how can we even begin to empathize with someone if we can't agree on what's right and wrong in the first place?
It's a real challenge.
And then, kind of related to that, we're seeing this huge decline in trust, right? Trust in institutions, in leaders, and experts. Where does that fit into this whole empathy puzzle?
When we lose trust in authority figures, in institutions, it creates this sense of disillusionment. We feel detached from the larger community.
Like we're all just on our own.
In a way, yeah. And that can make it harder to care about the well-being of others, to feel connected to something bigger than ourselves.
Wow, okay. This is there's a lot to unpack, and honestly, it's kind of depressing. But, in your notes, you had this question that really stuck with me. You were wondering if we're focusing too much on grades, on achievements, and not enough on, like, raising good humans. Can we actually teach empathy?
We can. There's research showing that things like social emotional learning programs, they can make a real difference. They help kids understand their own emotions, learn how to navigate relationships, make responsible decisions.
So it's not like you're just born with a certain amount of empathy and that's it.
No, not at all. It's a skill, and it can be developed.
That's good to hear. But man, parents these days, they're up against a lot, right? I mean, kids are bombarded with messages that kind of contradict everything we're trying to teach them at home.
It's true. Social media, peer pressure, it's a lot. But I think the most important thing is to model empathy ourselves, to create a supportive environment at home, to have open conversations with our kids about the challenges they face.
Okay, so after all this talk about empathy eroding, are we doomed? Are we headed for a world without compassion?
Not necessarily. I mean, look, the fact that you're even concerned about this, that you're asking these questions, it shows that you care. And that's a good sign.
Yeah, well, that's a relief. But with all these complex factors at play, it's hard to know where to even begin, right? What can we do?
Honestly, I think it starts with ourselves. Being more conscious of our own actions, really listening to people, even when we disagree with them, trying to understand their perspective.
That's a good point.
Engaging in meaningful conversations that bridge divides, supporting initiatives that strengthen our communities, and most importantly, just being kind.
I like that. Simple acts of kindness, but they add up, right?
They do. If we all make a conscious effort, it can make a real difference.
So a final thought for our listeners to take with them. What's one question they can ask themselves every day to keep this conversation going, to make empathy a priority?
Ask yourself, what small act of empathy can I perform today? It could be anything. Listening to a friend who's having a tough time, volunteering in your community, even just smiling at a stranger. Those small actions, they ripple outward. They create a more compassionate world, one interaction at a time.
I love that. It's a good reminder that even small actions can have a big impact. But on that note, thanks for joining us for another deep dive. We'll see you next time.